The sea offered no mercy. It was not the cold that killed them, but the fear of a sound they had never heard before. A screaming missile that turned brave men into ash. The smell of the sea is usually clean, a promise of freedom and wide skies. But on this day, it smelled of iron and coming doom. General Sosukakuni stood on the bluff of his island, his breath catching the cold air, watching the impossible. 900 warships, a forest of alien masts, were pushing the waves toward his shore. He had 80 samurai. They had 20,000 invaders. This wasn't a battle. It was a sacrifice arranged by the gods of war. The code of the samurai was built on honor, skill, and a fair fight, but the thing sailing toward them was not fair. It was a machine of overwhelming power, a brutal, efficient war engine designed to crush the spirit long before the sword could be drawn. This is the true story of Tsushima, where the old ways died not by the sword, but by the terrifying sound of the future. The island of Tsushima was small, a stepping stone between the great land of Korea and the sacred shores of Japan. To General Sosukakuni, it was his home, his duty, and now his grave. He had gathered his men near the small harbor. 80 samurai, their armor polished, their swords sharp, their faces grim. 80 men against the world. He kept his gaze fixed on the sea, but his mind was already fighting the battle he knew he could not win. The ships were closer now, the water thick with them, like a swarm of insects blotting out the horizon. They didn't sail, they marched on the waves. The problem of honor. Sosukakuni was a man built on the traditions of his ancestors. He knew the rules of war. A challenge should be issued, the names of the warriors declared, and then a clean, single combat before the armies clashed. This was the way of the samurai. It was honorable. It gave dignity to death. But the enemy did not care about dignity. They cared about killing. They look like demons, whispered a young warrior, Kenji, his hand gripping his katana's hilt so tightly his knuckles were white. So many? Are they even men? They were men, but they were different. They were Mongols, soldiers of Kublai Khan, the great emperor from the north, who ruled half the known world. They were not fighting for personal glory. They were fighting for the Khan's will. They were organized like a single, monstrous body, and their tactics were ruthless. As the first Mongol boats crunched onto the sand, Sosukakuni raised his sword. For the emperor, for Japan, he roared. It was a good, true roar, but it was lost in the chaotic noise already pouring from the enemy ships. The terrifying new sound. The samurai charged. Their training was perfect. They expected to meet the enemy in a line, sword to sword, spear to spear. But the Mongols didn't line up. Before the samurai could even reach the beach, a terrifying, cracking sound split the air. It was not the sound of a bow or a spear striking wood. It was a pop, followed by a high-pitched, screaming whistle, and then blinding pain and fire. "Keep moving!" Sosukakuni shouted, but the line was already breaking. The Mongols were using strange weapons, what the terrified Japanese would later call thunder bombs or fire pots. These were simple explosives thrown from small catapults or by hand. They didn't need to hit a man directly. The sound alone was enough to shatter the concentration of the samurai. The smoke was acrid, burning the eyes, and the sheer noise was overwhelming. The samurai's code of honor focused on the beauty of the katana, the personal duel, the display of individual courage. But how could you display courage against a smoke cloud and a weapon that screamed and exploded from 100 yards away? Kenji watched his friend, Hiroshi, simply vanish in a burst of white-hot sound. There was no clean wound, no moment to say a final farewell. Just dust and a terrible ringing in his ears. This was not war. This was slaughter. The Mongols' technology didn't just kill the body. It murdered the very idea of a hero's death. The samurai were not ready for a war machine. They were ready for a duel. And in the face of this brutal, efficient force, the old ways crumbled into terrified chaos. The general, seeing his men hesitate, knowing the Mongol cavalry was now forming on the beach, took a deep breath. His path was clear, but his heart was heavy. Honor demanded a fight, but honor could not win against a bomb. He gripped his sword tighter, ready to charge into the fire and smoke, accepting that his last stand would be one of terror, not glory. General Sukekuni led the charge, a blur of polished steel and desperate fury. He cut down the first 3 Mongols he met, their armor feeling thin and foreign beneath his blade. This was the fight he understood, man against man, skill against skill. But as he looked up, he realized he was fighting an impossible battle not just against sheer numbers, but against a system. The Mongols did not fight as individuals. They fought as parts of a terrible, efficient machine. They were like a tidal wave that kept its shape. When a samurai cut down 1 Mongol, 2 immediately stepped into the empty space. They used their shields expertly, forming a tight wall of leather and wood that no single sword could break. "Break the line! Find a weakness!" shouted Kenji, the young samurai from the first chapter. He tried to swing his sword wide, aiming for the gaps between the shields, but the Mongols didn't leave gaps. They moved as one. The samurai, by tradition, were expected to find a worthy opponent, engage in a dramatic duel, and claim the head as proof of their bravery. The Mongols found this idea laughable. If one of their comrades was in a duel, 3 others would immediately surround the samurai, using their compound bows to shoot arrows into him from multiple angles, or simply using short, heavy spears to stab him from behind the shield wall. This was the core of the brutality, impersonal killing. The Mongols did not see the samurai as warriors deserving of respect. They saw them as obstacles to be removed with the greatest speed and efficiency. The ground was already littered with the dead, but the worst of the terror came from above. The Mongol archers were positioned on the high decks of their ships, creating a relentless, dark cloud of arrows that fell onto the beach. "Cover your heads!" So Sukekuni roared, holding his shield high, but the arrows were too many. They whistled down like a sudden, deadly rain shower. The samurai were used to the precise individual arrow of a duel. They were not used to the saturation fire. One arrow glanced off the general's helmet, tearing a piece of the leather strap on his chest plate. He felt the sting of 100 near misses. It wasn't just the arrows, it was the psychological drain. Every second, you had to worry about what was above you, what was in front of you, and the next terrifying crack of a fire pot. The noise was deafening. The crashing of the waves, the alien shouts of the Mongol officers, the thud of the arrows, and the screams of the wounded. This chaos was a deliberate Mongol tactic. It was designed to confuse, terrify, and break the enemy's formation. So Sukekuni realized that his men, though brave, were fundamentally fighting the wrong war. They were masters of the sword dance. The Mongols were masters of the slaughterhouse. The samurai's courage was a point of light. The Mongol army was a vast, crushing darkness that swallowed the light whole. The samurai code, to fight honorably and seek personal glory, was the very thing that made them vulnerable to this new, brutal geometry of death. Every time a samurai paused for a moment of reflection or a flourish of his sword, he was instantly met by a volley of arrows or a crushing shield charge. The Battle of Tsushima was not about who was the better fighter. It was about who had the better system for killing. The fighting raged for hours, but it was not a fair fight. It was a steady, terrible chipping away at the samurai forces. The 80 defenders were now perhaps 30, bleeding and exhausted. General Sosukakuni led his remaining men off the beach and into the narrow, wooded paths of the island, hoping to use the terrain to their advantage. "We must fight where their numbers cannot crush us," he gasped, wiping sweat and blood from his eyes. He still held his sword, but his arm ached from the constant parrying of spears and the deflection of arrows. As they retreated, the Mongols did not pursue them with individual zeal. Instead, they began using their most brutal weapon, the firepot or explosive bomb, the thunder bombs the samurai feared so much. These were small iron or ceramic spheres packed with gunpowder and shrapnel. They were thrown by hand or launched by small slings. When they landed, they didn't just explode. They made a sound like the world was tearing itself apart. Kenji, hunkered down behind a thick cedar tree, saw one land a few feet away. The noise was so sharp and intense it felt like a hammer hitting the inside of his skull. The blinding flash and the smoke were immediate, but the most terrible part was the screaming pieces of shrapnel that flew everywhere, tearing through wood and flesh alike. "It is the voice of the Oni, demons," cried one warrior, dropping his sword and clutching his ears. The man was untouched by the physical blast, but his mind had snapped from the sheer volume and terror. This was the height of the brutality. The weapon did not just inflict physical wounds, it inflicted psychological torture. For men who believed in a spiritual world where honor was everything, this technology was inexplicable. It was magic. It was the work of hell. The samurai code demanded that a warrior remain calm, focused, and ready for his death. But the thunder bombs stripped away all calm. They turned the warrior into a panicked animal. One brave samurai, seeing a group of Mongols pause, stepped out from cover and shouted his name and lineage, trying to challenge a leader to a duel, upholding the honor ritual. Before he could finish his boast, a flurry of arrows pinned his legs, and a fire pot thrown by a Mongol who hadn't even looked up exploded at his feet. The samurai's body was ripped apart in a sudden, brutal puff of smoke, his noble challenge silenced instantly. General Sosukakuni watched this scene and felt a crushing hopelessness. His own men were now stumbling, not fighting. The sight of a man's heroic challenge being answered by a cynical, anonymous explosion broke the core belief of the samurai, that courage and skill were the ultimate deciders. He knew then that they were fighting something bigger than an army. They were fighting the end of their world. The Mongols had brought a new, inhumane way of killing that valued efficiency over personal bravery, organization over honor. Tsushima was not just the site of a battle. It was the place where the cherished, ancient way of life for the Japanese warrior was murdered by screaming iron and gunpowder. The psychological toll was the cruelest act of all. As night fell over Tsushima, the battle did not stop. It merely changed form. The sound of explosions faded, replaced by the chilling, methodical sound of the hunt. The remaining samurai, perhaps 10 men, including General Sosukakuni and Kenji, had retreated into the deepest forest, wounded and out of supplies. For the samurai, a victory meant capturing the enemy's standard, perhaps taking a few noble prisoners, and showing respect to the fallen, even if they were enemies. The Mongols, however, had a different philosophy: total annihilation. They were not interested in glory or capture. They were interested in making an example of Tsushima. The remaining Japanese forces realized the cruelty of the Mongol army went beyond the battlefield. The Mongols employed small, swift hunting parties that tracked the wounded. They used short, sharp whistles and drums to communicate through the woods, a terrifying network of sound that closed in on the hidden defenders. "They don't sleep," whispered Kenji, his body shivering not just from the cold, but from sheer terror. "They search for every last breath." If a samurai was found wounded and unable to fight, the Mongols did not offer a quick, clean death. Instead, they often used their heavy, curved sabers to maim or decapitate them quickly, then moved on without a word, treating the final act of killing with cold, robotic efficiency. This lack of emotion, this complete absence of personal vendetta, made the brutality feel even more crushing. They were simply clearing the field. The most inhumane act, the one that truly broke the samurai spirit, was the treatment of the dead. In the morning, before they were forced to retreat, the samurai had seen the beach. The Mongols had not stopped to sort the dead, nor had they allowed the Japanese to retrieve their fallen comrades for a respectful burial. Instead, the bodies of the fallen samurai were treated like garbage. They were dragged, piled up, and sometimes used to form gruesome, unsteady bridges across small streams of water, simply to keep the Mongol boots dry. The Mongols saw the bodies as tactical inconveniences, not the honored remains of warriors. This was a profound violation of the samurai's religious and cultural beliefs. The Bushido Code demanded that a warrior spirit must be honored and sent peacefully to the next life through a proper ceremony. To see their comrades, men who had died upholding honor, being used as stepping stones was a deep, shocking wound to their souls. General Sosukakuni saw the broken body of Hiroshi, the young man who had been hit by the first fire pot, lying discarded near the water's edge. He wanted desperately to go back, to retrieve his warrior's remains, to give him a piece of earth and a prayer. But he knew if he did, he would only become another piece of refuse for the Mongol boots. The brutality of the Mongol army was not just in their weapons, but in their contempt for the enemy's dignity, both in life and in death. This organized, cold, and utterly disrespectful treatment of the fallen was the final, crushing demonstration that their world of honor, ritual, and respect had been overwhelmed by a new age of total war, where efficiency was the only code. The sun rose on the second day, a beautiful, clear morning that felt profoundly wrong for the terrible things happening beneath its light. General Sosukakuni and Kenji, the last known survivors of the 80, were perched on a high ridge overlooking the wrecked harbor. They watched as the Mongols methodically secured the beach, cleaning their weapons, and organizing their massive army for the push into the main Japanese islands. They were efficient, cold, and utterly successful. Kenji, barely an adult, was weeping silently, not from pain but from the death of his beliefs. "General," he whispered, his voice broken, "they have no honor. We fought with our souls, and they fought with iron boxes that scream. What was the use of my training? What was the meaning of Bushido if one sound can erase a lifetime of duty?" This was the deepest brutality of Tsushima. It didn't just kill the men, it killed the meaning of their lives. The samurai code taught that a noble death was eternal victory. But the Mongols offered no noble death, only anonymous technological annihilation. Sosukakuni, though exhausted, felt a clear, cold resolve settle over him. He looked at the young man, his heart breaking for the world Kenji would now inherit. "The meaning, Kenji," the general said, his voice husky, "was for us. The enemy's honor is their own shame, but our duty is to die well. Not for victory, but for the story." The general knew they could not escape. They were hunted, surrounded, and starving. He looked down at the encampment and saw a small group of high-ranking Mongol officers moving toward the center of the beach. "Go, Kenji," the general commanded, thrusting his sword toward the dense forest opposite the ridge. "If you live, you must tell them what happened here. Not how we died, but how they fought." Kenji shook his head, refusing to leave his general. "That is an order," Sosukakuni roared, the authority of his rank cutting through the boy's terror. He did not wait for a response. He turned and began walking down the ridge toward the heart of the Mongol camp. He didn't charge wildly. He walked, slowly, deliberately, his battered armor scraping against the rocks. He stopped when he was close enough for the Mongol guards to see him clearly. He raised his sword and, in a final act of cultural defiance and personal honor, he yelled his name, his lineage, and his challenge, exactly as the tradition demanded. He spoke his truth to a force that had no ears for it. The Mongol response was swift and impersonal. There was no duel, no brave single fighter stepping forward. Instead, a volley of arrows flew from the shield wall, followed by the terrifying, deafening crack of a thunder bomb that landed a few feet from the general. So Sukekuni's last sound was a muffled gasp, swallowed by the explosion. He died as he had lived, a man of the old world, trying to uphold a code of honor against a brutal new age of war that had no place for him. His death was a final, desperate statement against the inhumanity of technology and overwhelming force. The Battle of Tsushima was officially over, leaving behind only the cold reality of a world where skill and bravery were no match for organized, efficient, and merciless killing. Kenji, the last survivor, watched from the high ridge until the sun reached its highest point. He saw the Mongols finish their grim work, securing the island and building fortifications. Then, he turned and began the long, perilous journey across the water to the main Japanese islands. He carried no trophy, no banner, only the terrible memory of Tsushima. When Kenji finally reached the mainland and told his story, the leaders and the other samurai were shocked into silence. They had expected news of a glorious, though failed, defense. They received a description of massacre and systematic annihilation. His account focused on the truly brutal parts, the screaming weapons, the firepots that broke the mind before the body, the cold efficiency, the Mongol army fighting as one with no respect for individual duels, the contempt for the dead, the use of honored warriors' bodies as stepping stones. This message was more important than any military report. It told the Japanese not just how the Mongols fought, but who they were. The Mongols were not interested in the noble exchange of war. They were interested only in total conquest and absolute dominance. The brutality at Tsushima was a warning. Surrender or be erased. The failure at Tsushima forced the Japanese to confront a horrifying reality. Their ancient, beloved way of fighting was obsolete. Honor, while beautiful, was a weakness when faced with a brutal technological war machine. They realized they could not beat the Mongols by challenging them to duels. They had to fight them the way the Mongols fought, with organization, impersonal tactics, and defensive fortification. The lesson of Tsushima was that the life of a single warrior was meaningless next to the strategic goal. The memory of the 20,000 invaders and the terrifying efficiency they displayed ignited a furious resolve across Japan. The brutal defeat did not make them surrender. It made them change. They began to build massive stone walls and earthworks along the coastlines. They trained their armies to fight in large groups, not just as individual heroes. The ghost of General Sukekuni's failure taught them that tradition must bend to the necessity of survival. The Battle of Tsushima in 1274 became a scar on the soul of the Japanese warrior class. It was a secret shame, a place where the purity of the samurai code was overwhelmed by inhumane realism. The fear of the thunder bombs and the vast, faceless Mongol hordes never truly left them. The sacrifice of the 80 samurai, led by Sukekuni, was not for a victory they achieved, but for a lesson they paid for with their lives. They were the bridge that carried the terror of the Mongols' advanced, brutal warfare to the rest of Japan. They died in silence and chaos, so that the rest of the nation could be ready to fight the second, larger invasion that they knew would come. The cold marble of the palace walls back in the capital still held many secrets, but none were as powerful as the enduring memory of the screaming iron and the broken spirits left behind on the bloody shores of Tsushima, the island where honor met pure, efficient brutality and lost everything.